Good evening. My name is Amanda Arena, and I'm really excited for this presentation tonight. I really enjoyed diving into understanding trauma and stress-related disorders and the complex symptoms and interventions that are used to treat these disorders. So one of the most interesting things that I learned about trauma is how complex the interventions are and the different types of organizational and clinical theories that really are used to treat um, P, specifically PTSD. So one of the since trauma is so broad and there's many populations that are impacted, right? Trauma does not discriminate race, gender, age, or um, because of that, I've specifically focused on post-traumatic stress disorder and among veterans. So there's two reasons why I did that. One is because of the amount of research that was available, and the second was because of the the overwhelming statistics that I found about veterans and PTSD, which, well, I think there's a natural assumption that yes, with PTSD and veterans there is a connection. I guess I was still surprised by some of the statistics that I found. So let's see. According to the Department of Veteran Affairs, approximately 11 to 20% of veterans were diagnosed with PTSD that served in Operations Iraqi Freedom and enduring Operations Enduring Freedom. Right. So the what makes treating veterans a little bit more difficult for PTSD is the high risk for being diagnosed with complex trauma, or complex PTSD. So complex PTSD happens when there's a prolonged exposure or multiple exposure to traumatic events. So this can occur over just a short period of time, or it can occur maybe a traumatic event occurred during their childhood, and then something again occurred in the as an adult. So why are veterans more prevalent to be diagnosed with complex PTSD? Well, first is that veterans from Operations Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom were actually more likely to serve more than one tour in the combat zone. That's mostly because of medical interventions and safety precautions, like safety equipment that allows them the survival rate is much higher than there was in previous wars. So the second reason why is actually the high risk and probability that a veteran was exposed to trauma outside of a combat zone. So, for instance, 60% of veterans reported exposure to intimate partner abuse as an adult. 30% reported experiencing physical abuse as a minor, and 20% reported a history of sexual abuse as a minor. In addition to previous exposure to trauma, there's also we need to take into consideration the risk of military sexual trauma. So according to Department of Affairs, 55% of women report sexual harassment, 23% of female veterans reported sexual assault, and 38% of male veterans have reported sexual harassment. So these, of course, these are reported. So because trauma is so complex, I wanted to focus on just one specific area of trauma treatment. And so I focused on the cognitive behavioral theory. A lot of the interventions that I saw would take into, like I said, an organizational, systemic, behavioral, narrative therapy. Like they took all of this into consideration, but they often paired with the cognitive behavioral theory. Um, and so one of the models that I specifically focused on was the STAIR narrative model. So the STAIR narrative model is was originally created for children who were exposed to trauma early on in life, but they've developed it or adapted it to treat veterans with PTSD because of the when complex PTSD is present, right? Due to past exposure to trauma. So, the stair narrative model is usually an eight. It's a there's a finite number of sessions. So there's usually 16, 18, maybe 20. The idea is usually it's split into 8 into 8. The first 8 focus on emotional regulation and emotional regulation and interpersonal skills, with the idea that once you develop those appropriate like coping mechanisms and emotional regulation, then you can move on to the actual treatment, like the exposure treatment for trauma, and it tends to be more effective once you've been able to develop the certain other emotional skills. So for this session, what you'll see is my husband will be playing the role of a veteran who has re-enlisted several times, has done several tours. So not only has he been exposed to a combat zone several times, but he also has a history of child abuse. After his most recent tour, he was diagnosed with PTSD after having nightmares and flashbacks and angry outbursts. And this session is going to be focused specifically on his anger management skills, and being able to understand, identify, and describe his emotion so that he can understand not only what is he feeling, but what the triggers are, and then how to cope with it in the future so that he has a healthier emotional response whenever, right, because we can't get rid of those triggers. Something is, what those triggers are, so that way he can respond better to them. So I'm really looking forward to it. I hope you enjoy it, and thank you.